So it's a great pleasure for me and for us to have Michael with us. Michael, it's one of our best friends. It's a bright clinician and one of the more important exponents of control mastery theory. He is the author of one of the books that I find more fascinating, which applies CMT to the understanding of a complex and interesting phenomena, which is arousal. And today, Michael will talk about his conception about sexuality and sexual fantasies according to control mastery theory. So welcome, Michael. And when you
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. And probably some of you heard me talk a year and a half ago when I was in Rome. But I thought what I would do is start by describing a couple of the core concepts of control mastery theory. And I think these are concepts that many of you already are very familiar with, but I'm going to explain them as if you were not, to make sure that all of us have the same context, theoretically, when I start to talk specifically about my research on sexuality. So I would say this, that our theory, Joe Weiss was my therapist, he was my supervisor, he was my mentor and friend, and it has influenced every aspect of my work. So our theory is simple in many ways. We argue that in the course of growing up, all of us develop pathogenic beliefs. These are beliefs about the world and about people and about relationships. Pathogenic beliefs basically say that if we pursue normal developmental goals and aims, that will somehow risk hurting our caretakers or in some way threatening our attachments. So, for example, a pathogenic belief might be, if I'm too assertive or confident, I'll threaten my parents. Or if I'm too dependent, my caretakers will feel drained and reject me. Or if I'm too selfish or too independent, too confident, my poor mother will feel left out. Or a belief that I'm supposed to take care of my mother or my father and defer my own needs in the service of taking care of hers. So, as I'm sure is true for you too, many of my patients grew up feeling omnipotently responsible for one or both parents. And as they get older, they come to feel guilty about leaving them, about separating, or about doing better than them. So we focus a lot in our theory on guilt, separation guilt, survivor guilt. And that's our theory of psychopathology. But I think Weiss's most important contribution was his insight about how psychotherapy works. In this, his special focus was always on safety, psychological safety. He was in a conversation, you might say, with Freud, especially with Freud's later theory about the prominent role that the ego plays in the emergence of warded off memories or feelings or other contents in therapy. Freud, as you know, grounded as he was in instinct theory, believed that instincts are held in place by the ego and the superego, but that the sheer force of these impulses can and do kind of break through periodically when the defenses are weakened. If you think about how this applies to sexual impulses, he saw as having a propulsive, impulsive quality that sometimes overcomes repressions and become manifest. Weiss said no. He believed that we, our egos, exercise a lot more control in regulating what comes into consciousness than Freud thought, and does so by an unconscious assessment of safety. So when the therapist, we believe, through his or her interpretations or actions, creates the necessary conditions of safety, unconscious and repressed memories and feelings can and do emerge. Now, in general, we think that conditions of safety usually means that the dangers that a patient's pathogenic beliefs predict are being disconfirmed or negated somehow by the therapist, sometimes through what the therapist says, and other times by the therapist providing a corrective emotional experience. Some simple examples. A patient who grew up with very rejecting parents tells me that she wants to cut back on our sessions to every other week. I think about it along the lines that Weiss would think about it, and I tell her I think that's a bad idea and that she should instead come twice a week. She seems to relax a little bit and has a memory of her mother locking her out of the house as a punishment for a very small infraction. This memory was repressed. She had the pathogenic belief, this patient, that she wasn't supposed to be protected. When I disconfirmed this belief by saying, oh, I don't think you should cut back, I think you should come more often, this very sad memory of hers could safely emerge. For us, paying attention to safety and the unique conditions that constitute safety for each person is the whole ball game. It's all of how therapy works. So let's try to apply this to sexuality and sexual fantasies. I argue this, and this is my central proposition. All sexual fantasies and preferences have as their function the creation of certain conditions of psychological safety that allows sexual excitement and arousal to emerge. That's the whole theory. So let me just repeat it. The details of sexual fantasies are constructed creatively by our unconscious minds in order to temporarily make it safe enough for us to experience sexual arousal and excitement. And I say that if you study the details of these fantasies and preferences, you often find that to the patient, they are disconfirming certain pathogenic beliefs that otherwise are inhibiting or holding back sexual excitement and pleasure. That's the whole theory in a nutshell. Let me take it apart a little bit and then reassemble the pictures, the pieces. First of all, I'm using the concept of sexual fantasies and sexual preferences interchangeably. I am calling all of our particular sexual preferences, I'm calling them all fantasies. And think about all that that includes, okay? It doesn't have to be a discrete and palpable physical experience of arousal. It's all the little things that go into sexual attraction. I mean, let's say you find someone especially attractive or an image of someone especially appealing. You might not be getting sexually aroused per se, but something is going on in your brain, in your mind, that denotes attraction. you know, it's like thinking about your type. If you have a type, all right, is he or she rugged, tough, soft, tall, short, skinny, heavy, blonde, redhead, someone who's worn out, or someone who looks bubbly? Does he or she seem confident? Or does he or she seem emotionally available, maybe in need of caretaking? The permutations are endless, really, and they are all meaningful. They're all part of what I'm going to say are sexual fantasies. Now, when it comes to actual sex, think about the possible repertoire of preferences. Does someone prefer to be on the top or the bottom? How much is oral sex, especially a turn on or a turn off? Does the person prefer eye contact or no eye contact? Does someone especially like to have sex naked or partially clothed? In a well-lighted room or in darkness? Sexual life includes all of those preferences, you see, including the particular, sometimes, scenarios or narratives, even if they're very brief and subtle, that surround sex. So is there some kind of plot or script that's especially arousing for somebody that involves seduction, overcoming resistances, or play acting variations of dominance and submission? Is everyone happy in the scene, or is it rough? I'm saying that these are all sexual fantasies. So fantasies are not just the highly private daydreams that someone might have when he or she is masturbating, or in your particular choice of pornography. I'm talking about anything and everything that contributes to the heightening of erotic interest. Now, let me add two caveats. I understand that much of our attraction, our choices, preferences, and our culture are shaped by our culture and socialization, and includes all the ways that our culture objectifies women, or engages in fat shaming, or idealizes certain body types. But I think that these images, these roles, these rules are unconsciously appropriated by individuals in the service of their own aims, which of course importantly include the aim of experiencing sexual pleasure. And see, I think that everyone has what I would call their own sweet spot, where various elements cohere and which contribute to maximum sexual arousal. So what I'm saying is that somebody might be very open-minded and flexible about what he or she likes. They can enjoy all sorts of different things. But I think everybody has a place they gravitate to which provides maximum excitement. And also, obviously, our sexual preferences have to be negotiated in the real world. So what ends up happening in the bedroom is invariably a function of compromise. But I still think we each have something that approaches a core sexual fantasy. So let me return then to the theoretical proposition I'm making. I'm saying that, first of all, the desire and the need for sexual pleasure isn't something we need to explain. Freud did. He developed and worked with an instinct theory, and he had a notion about psychosexual stages, and even that there were special types of libido appropriate to each stage. We don't think so. We're not interested in that question. We think it's a given that sexual pleasure, the capacity for it, and the desirability of it is hardwired and transparent. What isn't hardwired are the conditions under which sexual pleasure can be experienced. So my argument is this. Again, sexual fantasies make it safe to experience pleasure. Now, I want to pause for a minute because it's almost as if it's a two-step process. But the two steps happen at the same moment and they feel like it's the same thing. Well, what are the two steps? There's the fantasy and then there's the pleasure. There's a fantasy that makes it safe to experience pleasure. So it almost is as if that's two steps, but really they happen at the same time. The sexual fantasy feels exciting, but it does because of the function it's serving. So now we're at the heart of the issue. To say that sexual fantasies make it safe to feel pleasure, the implication is that were it not for these fantasies, we would experience pleasure as a real or potential danger of some kind. Because, then we would be motivated, wouldn't we, to inhibit it or repress it. So it leads us to the question of what we think are the dangers psychically that we presume are present with sexual arousal. So what I argue in the book is that the psychic risks or dangers connected with arousal fall into two broad categories. The first category involves guilt and worry. And the second category involves shame, inferiority, and helplessness. Both of these sets of affects and beliefs inhibit and pose a threat to sexual arousal. So if these are the dangers, let's just take a step deeper into, let's say, the first class of threats that I'm calling guilt and worry. The proposition is this: you can't get maximally aroused or excited if you're worried about or guilty about hurting someone. Now, most of us would take for granted in our clinical work and with studying control mastery that most of us grow up feeling somewhat guilty at times about hurting or burdening loved ones. It's somehow in the nature of our attachments. So why would we not think that we might worry or feel inhibited about hurting people with our sexual desires? See, Weiss says that many people have pathogenic beliefs already that tell them they're supposed to be responsible for, worried about, and guilty about hurting important people to whom they're attached. That's a core of our theory. And I argue, well, that's also true with our sexual desires and our sexual needs. Now, how does that work exactly? How do our sexual desires potentially hurt or burden others, and therefore pose a threat? Well, here's my argument. I think there is a dimension of sexual pleasure and excitement that is inherently selfish. I call this dimension of sexual excitement sexual ruthlessness. By ruthlessness, I'm not talking about being actually mean or sociopathic. I'm using the term more in the way that Winnicott used it, which has to do with a kind of inherent desire to use another person. And as a consequence, now follow me here, this is important, a desire to not feel empathy about the other person's well-being. He says that the word ruth, which is the core, the root word, means care or concern. And to be ruthless is the opposite of ruth. And so ruthless means without care and concern. So I was reaching for a concept that represented the opposite of empathic attunement. And I came upon this concept of ruthlessness. You know, empathic attunement is, in the popular culture, sexual arousal is supposed to be maximized when you are completely attuned to the other person's needs. And what I'm saying is there is an inherent dimension of healthy, normal sexual excitement that is inherently selfish and that doesn't want to be empathic toward the other person's well-being. One patient described it this way. She said her excitement felt like a wave that builds and builds and then crashes on the shore. And she didn't want to have to worry about whether the shore could take it. So I posit that there's a dimension of sexual desire and excitement that's quite selfish, and that gets inhibited if the person feeling that excitement is too worried about or too guilty about and responsible for the inner life of the other. And I think this is a normal part of sexual excitement, a normal, healthy part. Now, I also believe that empathy and the awareness of the internal states of the other are also crucial for maximum sexual arousal and pleasure. Both are important and both go into good sex. But I think there's a dialectic, a tension between these two poles of a good sexual connection. If one is too ruthless, then it's like masturbation, using the other person. If one is too empathic, then I will argue that sexual boredom can result. To the extent that one feels overly worried about and responsible for the internal welfare of a loved one or a sexual partner, then this ruthlessness, this not caring about the welfare of the other, poses a threat to one's experience of sexuality. Empathy for others can make us good therapists and good partners, but it may also threaten our sexual lives. So if I'm right here, then one function of sexual fantasies must be to lessen the effects of guilt and worry. And in fact, that's what many sexual fantasies do. This is a process, I'm going to describe these fantasies and how they function, that happens in our unconscious minds, not our rational egos. And it happens in a nanosecond without conscious control, so much that it feels biological, but it's not. So, examples of what I'm talking about here. So I've had many patients who enjoy fantasies or actual enactments of fantasies of domination and submission. These fantasies may involve sexual positions They may involve the choreography and the storylines of real sexual encounters. So I mean, the choreography, by that I mean, might involve an enactment of a sadomasochistic sexual scenario up to and including explicit bondage fantasies for some people. Or it might be a more subtle version in which one's excitement comes from the sense, the perception that maybe one's partner is driven by animal desires. The partner just has to have it and is aggressive in taking it. That this quality might be, for some, what feels so exciting. So why are these depictions of another person so exciting? Well, it's because of this. If the other person seems strong, then you don't have to worry about that person. If the other person is driven, then you don't have to be responsible for micromanaging that person's feelings. You don't have to feel responsible for that person's pleasure and that person's excitement. Now, this kind of thing might be overt, or like a fantasy of somebody having their way with you, taking over, being overtly controlling, or it might be so subtle as to involve the way somebody looks, or the real or imagined personal characteristics of the person. There are people, for instance, who find it especially sexually attractive in a sexual object to have that person look like a bad boy or a bad girl. The sexual love object, perhaps in other cases, might need to be big, or perhaps only communicate the sense of being rough and self-centered. What could be the appeal, you see, the sex appeal of this? Well, you don't have to worry about or feel guilty about these love objects. Sometimes a person wrestling with issues of guilt and worry is drawn to a partner who appears to them to be utterly selfish, self-contained, and not empathic at all. Not because the person values a lack of empathy, but because that person equates self-centeredness with strength. And you're drawn to someone who appears strong because you don't have to feel guilt and worry about that person who you've constructed as strong. If that person can be rough and tough and strong, then so can you without guilt. So I've had many patients over the years describe their partner as too sensitive to their pleasure. Can you imagine? My partner is so worried about my pleasure, and I wish sometimes that he or she would just throw me on the bed and fuck me. And that's reflecting a wish to have your partner be ruthless so that you can also be ruthless. And of course, this theme is present in advertising all the time. And if I can make this work, I'm going to show you some slides, advertising slides. Okay, here we go. So this is an ad. These are some ads. Let me see if I can get this. Hold on. There it is. Slideshow, play from this. Okay, so these are some advertisements from fashion magazines. These first are of guys, and then I'll show you some of women. And I'm choosing these. These are not unusual. Okay, look at this guy, right? This is not a guy that you have to worry about his inner child. And he's not going to worry about your inner child. He's depicted as ruthless. And these depictions are used because they sell, because they're popular. And of course, the pictures like this of women as well. This is an ad. This is a woman who is clearly a phallic woman in the old Freudian terms of a phallic woman. It's a woman is all points and sharp edges, and she's tough. So is she. She's tough, isn't she? She's not going to fuck around. She is not going to, you don't have to worry about her. You don't have to worry about her inner life. She's just there to rough it up with you. So is she. So if you pay attention, you see these images all the time, everywhere. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about the whole idea of phallic women. But, okay, so, so if you don't have to worry about somebody, the point is that if you don't have to worry about somebody, you can get turned on. And if you have to worry about them, it inhibits you. And these men and women that I showed you, they're images of a certain type of strength and a certain type of sturdy toughness, which is attractive to us because we don't have to feel guilty about these people. Now, I've treated women who have, in this case, domination fantasies, who think painfully that this somehow reflects their true self, completely at odds with their conscious, rational sense of themselves as a strong feminist. This is a false belief. In fact, such a fantasy of being dominated or overpowered in some way usually involves someone's fear of being too powerful, of hurting the other person with her sexual needs and desires. So here's another example of this, a variation on this theme. I treated a guy who came in to see me because he was unable to get sexually excited with his wife. Maybe his wife sent him in to see me. And he told me a little bit about his background. He mentioned that his mother had just moved to town from the East Coast and that she was making him feel guilty about not spending more time with her. And he also mentioned that his wife, who he loved quite a bit, was depressed. And she had lost a child from another marriage a couple of years earlier, and she'd never really recovered from that. So he told me that although he couldn't get excited by his wife, he did masturbate quite a bit. In fact, he masturbated every day. So I asked him about it very explicitly. Now, I want to make a note that someone's core masturbation fantasy is usually highly important in understanding them because it's not something that has to be negotiated with anyone. It's totally under your control. So I asked him about what he did when it came to masturbation and pornography. What did he like to look at? What was his choice? And he said this. There was a little interchange. I wrote down my notes afterwards. I said, so what do you think about or fantasize about when you're masturbating? He said, well, you know, nothing really. I use porn. I said, okay, so what kind of porn do you use? He said, well, you know, the usual kind. And I said, well, humor me and describe, if you don't mind, what the usual kind is for you. And he was a little embarrassed. He said, you know, it's like scenes with women with large breasts giving blowjobs to men. And the women and everyone in these scenes is excited and very turned on and happy. So I put all this data together and I told him, I made this interpretation. I said, you worry about not being able to make women happy. Your masturbation fantasies are like an antidote to this feeling and belief. The porn that you use has women who are big-breasted, which means they have a lot to give and they enjoy giving their man pleasure. These women are not depressed. Instead, they're eager to please you, thereby taking the responsibility off your shoulders of having to please them, a responsibility that ordinarily burdens you and makes sex difficult. And we'll talk more a little later how we can use this theory in our clinical work. I use it all the time. If you can get someone to give you a little bit of detail about the kind of sex they like, the kind of porn they like, the kind of sexual fantasies they are drawn to, you can usually infer quite a bit about their underlying psychological makeup, as I hope to demonstrate. Now, the last example of fantasies that have as their function disconfirming guilt and worry has to do with fetishism, fetishes. Fetishism is when somebody gets sexually aroused by an inanimate object or a partial characteristic of somebody else's body or personality. When a person is reduced to an object of desire, that's a fetish. Or when a whole person, a whole body is reduced to a part of the body or a part of the person, that's a fetish. For example, the most common fetish that's written about in the psychoanalytic literature, at least, involves men who get aroused by women who have high heels, their shoes, a shoe fetishist. So you think about us, this guy gets turned on by high heels. What is going on there? Well, Freud had a theory about it that was almost correct. In fact, it's my favorite essay of Freud's, and it's almost correct. Freud said, you know, and think about fetishes, you know, like high heels are fetish, but, you know, parts of the body are fetished all the time. Asses are fetish, breasts are fetishized, muscularity is fetishized, height is fetishized, weight is fetishized. In other words, anything can become the object of sexual interest. Even some idea about the other person's personality might be the turn on, right? Now, Freud's theory about fetishism and these men that get turned on by high heel shoes, women's shoes, goes like this. This is Freud now. He says, these women are phallic women in the man's mind. These women are phallic. And the high heel shoes are an emblem and they represent a phallic woman. Now, why would a man get aroused by a phallic woman? Freud asks. He starts with the premise that all men have castration anxiety and that for boys, their castration anxiety is worsened, and in fact, it's almost confirmed by the sight of a girl's genitals, that she doesn't have a penis. This is Freudian theory, right? So the boy feels anxiety about the fact that the girl doesn't look like him. So in Freud's view, when the boy looks at a girl who looks phallic or is wearing high heel shoes and looks phallic, it's exciting because it reassures him against castration anxiety. And I think a lot of that's true, except that I don't think it has to do with castration anxiety. I think it has to do with the image of a woman being strong. These are strong, tough women. And that helps a man get excited because it helps him disconfirm pathogenic beliefs that have to do with guilt and worry. So women have fetishes all the time. I treated a woman, a Caucasian woman, a white woman, who was especially aroused by thoughts of having sex with a black man. In her mind now, framed as it is by racial stereotypes, a black man was primarily large, had a large and hard body, and was not someone with a complicated interior emotional life. Given her assumption, unconscious assumption, that black men were bodies and didn't have hearts and minds, this Caucasian woman could become sexually excited because she didn't have to care about or feel responsible for or worry about his feelings. That's a fetish. In fact, I think we could say that most forms of objectification serve this same function, don't they? Think about it. Reassuring the person against feelings of guilt and concern and care, worry, and responsibility, all of which can dampen and do dampen sexual desire. If you're objectifying someone or something, you don't have to worry about an object who at that moment is not a whole person with a complicated interior life. That's the essence of objectification. Now, sometimes these fantasies or preferences are so bizarre that we encounter it, they seem impossible to really understand. But using this model, we can almost always decode or decipher the meaning of even the most extreme fantasies. For example, a patient of mine, his sexual preference and his fantasy life was based on this, was he would hire women to urinate on him. That's what he needed to get excited, a version of what's called golden showers. Now, what the hell would something like this mean? How could we understand that? Well, this guy grew up feeling very guilty about the degree to which he felt disdain and contempt for his mother, who was a single mother, obese, a drug addict, and a street prostitute. He felt so guilty about the extent to which he looked down on her and felt contempt for her. So when he'd hire somebody to urinate on him, it was to counteract the feeling that he grew up pissing on his mother. And when he hired a woman to piss on him, it alleviated his guilt about pissing on his mother. Again, if you know something about someone's pathogenic beliefs, you can almost always infer a lot about their sexual fantasies. And here's the thing, if you understand their sexual fantasies, you can often infer a lot about their whole psyche, their pathogenic beliefs and what makes them tick. So now the second class of feelings and beliefs that inhibit our excitement, arousal, and that fantasies are intended to help us overcome involve affects of shame, helplessness, and inferiority. This whole class of feeling is what's associated, isn't it, with depression. And we know one of the symptoms, cardinal symptoms of depression, is called anhedonia, meaning an inability to experience pleasure. But of course, lots of people wrestle with feelings of unworthiness and inadequacy and inferiority in their life, even if they're not clinically depressed. So if you think about these affects, doesn't it make sense that they would inhibit sexual arousal? You can't get excited when you feel shitty about your life. You can get excited as a means of not feeling these things, but these affects really are inimical to arousal. Shame, you think about shame, it involves a feeling of being repulsive to others. Arousal involves a sense of being connected to others in a positive way. Shame is something we feel in response to someone's contempt. We feel aroused in response to someone's desire. See, shame makes us want to hide. Arousal and excitement makes us want to come out and play. So I ask this question, what kinds of fantasies or scenarios might selectively function to disconfirm feelings of shame and rejection and helplessness? Well, the obvious answer starts with this. Think of all of the sexualized experiences and fantasies that involve being attractive and sexually compelling to others. Might these not be perfect disconfirmations, perfect antidotes to feelings of low self-esteem? Might not fantasies of getting other people aroused and excited function to disconfirm feelings of worthlessness? It seemed to make sense to me. And I mean, it wouldn't have to be an elaborate exhibitionistic fantasy. It could just be getting a little excited or a little perked up about the thought that you look hot. It might be that you enjoy the fantasy of turning everybody's head, or even that you have a fantasy of driving other people wild with desire. It might be the fantasies of being so special and so attractive that someone else has to take a risk or violate an oath or commit some crime in order to have you sexually. The greater the risk or sacrifice, then, the greater the payoff and the more powerful then the reassurance. This happens all the time. This happens all the time. This happens in all the fantasies of seducing someone in authority, your therapist, a policeman, the president of the United States. It happens clinically. I see it clinically all the time. A patient, a gay man I treated, was especially aroused when having sex with his male partner that he, my patient, was being penetrated, anally penetrated. It wasn't the submission part of it that was arousing. It was the feeling that he was giving something special to his male partner. The feeling that the other man was happy and was enjoying him reassured my patient against the pathogenic feeling that he had nothing to offer a man, you see? Or I just recently began seeing a guy, African-American man, who could only get really excited about, he was gay, about a white man, a Caucasian man, and it was best if this man was married and a father. Now, it turned out after much work that this fantasy was exciting because it reassured my patient when it was happening that he, the patient, was valuable, because he'd grown up with a sense that being Black meant he was not valuable, and that being a white man was the pinnacle of self-esteem. And if he could have sex with and be involved with a white man who was married, he would be part of a special club of men who had all of this value in the world. And that was very exciting to him, you know? I mean, these are moments where somebody feels special. Think about all the moments where somebody feels special. It disconfirms pathogenic beliefs that you're damaged, that you're defective, or you're disappointing to others. And these beliefs, you know, left alone, inhibit your sexual desire. Or think about this one. You know, there's a common fantasy in women, actually in men too, but I'm just take up one part of it. Fantasy in women of having sex with several men at the same time, okay? The fantasy, again, is about the woman with more than one man. These fantasies seem to have two functions, serve two functions at the same time. First, because there's two men, the woman doesn't have to worry about wearing a man out, burdening him, because there's two to share the responsibility, right? And the second thing is that there's two men paying special attention to her and being very excited by her, which reassures her that she's special and valuable, okay? Now, this is happening in our culture all the time, right? This is happening with our idealization of youth. Think about this. The idealization of youth often functions as a kind of psychic antidepressant. So a young man or a young woman becomes the object of arousal and desire. It's important in understanding this, and a couple of guys taught me this in treating them, that, you know, emotions are intrinsically infectious. If people around us are happy, this is sort of a simple-minded way to put it, but if people around us are happy, it's easier for us to be happy. If people around us are unhappy, it's easier for us to be unhappy. So this is especially true when we're children, you see, because the atmosphere and attitudes and well-being of our parents affect us powerfully, more than ever happens as an adult. So the negative states, when you grow up in a family that's very depressed, it's very easy to become depressed yourself. In part, it's the only way you have of belonging to such a family. But when you have sexual contact in your mind or in reality with someone who's young, the pedophile, let's call him a pedophile for a moment, is identifying with what he or she perceives to be the upbeat enthusiasm and innocence of the child, an energy that has not been worn down by life, like we might experience in relation to someone older. So this is a fantasy then. The pedophilic fantasy is an attempt to deal with internal feelings of depression. It's the Lolita fantasy is an antidepressant for men in particular, burdened by memories of their unhappy families and their unhappy mothers often. So I'll show you one picture that captures this pedophilic fantasy. And it goes like this. See if I can do it. Here we go. All right. So here's an ad for a department store, Macy's department store. And the caption is, letting the little girl shine through now and then. Now, if you deconstruct this image, you see that she has a little girl's kind of wistful demeanor, but her legs are spread. And if you saw the whole advertisement, you'd see she's wearing high heel shoes. Well, high heel shoes are a marker for sexualization. So this is a pedophilic fantasy, letting the little girl, so we're drawn to the little girl because the little girl helps us tap into an image, an energy that helps us with our feelings of depression. Here's another one. This is an ad. She has a kind of slightly young little girl look. She's young. And then down by her waist, there's a sign that says open and giving. You can't quite see it, but in the original, it's open and giving. She's also wearing high heel shoes. So it's clearly meant to evoke a sexualized dimension of youth. Okay. Now I've argued that in many, if not most, domination fantasies, you see, the excitement doesn't come from some intrinsic sadism. It comes from the fact that the one who is submissive is aroused. So I'm going to go back to this because you see this all the time, is if the person who's being dominated is aroused, it is a marker for the person being not hurt and happy. So if the object of whatever aggressive scenario is in the picture or in your fantasy or in reality, if the person being dominated or done to is aroused, then by definition, they're not hurt. And your unconscious mind responds with excitement sometimes for some people because it counteracts guilt. Now, there are some people, especially some men, who get aroused only by the real depiction of their love object, often women, being hurt. And there's a whole type of pornography in which it's not a sadomasochistic scenario in which the woman is excited, but it's real depictions of the woman being hurt. Now, for these men, it's not about guilt, but it has to do often, the few guys I've seen who fall into this category are guys who were terrorized as children. And the dynamic is identification with the aggressor. That is, the guy's raised in a family in which he's terrorized and frightened and traumatized by overt cruelty and aggression from parents. And he grows up and being helpless, like he was, is a state of mind you can't get aroused if you're helpless. It's why a real rape is never exciting. Rape fantasies are exciting sometimes, but never real rape. These guys grow up being very traumatized, but when they turn the tables and see a woman being really injured, it momentarily makes them feel safe enough to be able to get aroused. I think this model that I'm laying out also helps us understand the dynamics of sexual boredom. I would say this, that one of the dynamics behind sexual boredom involves the natural decline of sexual ruthlessness in longer-term intimate relationships. As two people become more intimate and see each other in every sort of vulnerable and painful situation, they often have a sort of symbiosis in which they know each other's internal worlds so well that they can't treat each other with the necessary, I'll say the necessary amount of selfishness, the necessary amount of ruthlessness, and the necessary amount of objectification in order for sexual success to occur. Intimacy in this model, then, is good for love, it's good for caretaking, but it can work against sexual excitement. You simply know each other too well. That's why when couples are trying to improve their sex lives, they experiment with things that create a sense of newness, of unfamiliarity, so they like to have sex in a different room in the house, or they have better sex when they're in a hotel, because it subliminally suggests that they're not home in all the customary ways, and therefore not so intimate and merged as they feel they are at home. Now, sometimes I even try to help a couple restore a sense of sexual urgency by encouraging them to find some way of objectifying each other, at least a little bit. See, in the context of an intimate relationship, when sexual ruthlessness is inhibited by familiarity and high degrees of empathy, if the couple can find ways to symbolically now use each other, objectify each other a little, it introduces the necessary distance required for ruthlessness and excitement to emerge. Now, I'm going to finish up in a little bit, but let me just comment on make a few generalizations about this theory that follow, I think, in this model. The first is that...
Michael, if
yes,
you can say also something about how to use your theory in the clinical work about sexuality and
I will,
the implication
absolutely.
that it has about the attitude that the therapist should assume when working with the patient, because it's very interesting in my
Yes,
opinion.
I will. Yes, I will. Thank you. The first generalization I want to make is that pathogenic beliefs are disconfirmed by sexual fantasies, but only temporarily and only in the service of a temporary experience of pleasure. These beliefs are not disconfirmed in someone's life in the way that we hope they will be in psychotherapy as a result of psychotherapy. Sexual fantasies permit sexual pleasure to occur. They don't change someone's core pathogenic beliefs. So there isn't the kind of learning that happens in psychotherapy. Now, the second thing, which gets a little bit to Francesco's question, is there's a natural resistance in people to analyzing their sexual fantasies for various reasons. Not the least of which, now get this now, is the fear that if they analyze it too much, it will go away. Of course, this never happens. It's never happened once in the history of life. You can analyze something, as we would say, until the cows come home, and the underlying sexual preferences will remain the same. See, sexual fantasies will always be necessary because I believe pathogenic beliefs will always be there to some degree. I think we reduce the pressure of pathogenic beliefs in therapy. I think we can make them milder, less interfering in our lives. But basic fears around attachment will always be there. And here's the thing about how we use these. The devil is in the details, as we say. So I ask people questions that other therapists don't ask. So like my patient who I asked what kind of pornography he likes. And he'll say, oh, the usual kind, because he's embarrassed. It's embarrassing talking about details of sex. But if you know the details, you are empowered, tremendously empowered to make powerful inferences about the person's, about what ails the person. So I ask detailed questions. If somebody says, they've been married a long time, no, they have some strains in their marriage and they don't really have a lot of sex. It's not like I leap into it, but I will ask them, I'll say, well, why don't you have sex? Well, you know, it's just like the magic is gone, the energy's not there. I might say, well, when you used to have sex, when things were really hot, what was that like? And if I can get somebody to suggest even the slightest detail about their sexual behavior and or fantasy life, that's enough. And often nowadays, especially with men, but increasingly with women, it's pornography. Pornography are sexual fantasies enacted on a screen for the excitement of the viewer. That's what they are. That's what pornography is. If you analyze the details of someone's preferred sexual fantasy that they like in pornography, you have all of the information you need. So often it's not like, I don't know, like one couple I worked with that lacked sexual energy and intensity. The problem was this. The problem was that he couldn't get aroused by her if they were face to face. And she required face-to-face contact because for her, what felt safe was the intimate connection of two people looking into each other's eyes. For him, looking into her eyes meant opening a door to her interior life, which he worried he'd have to make happy, he'd have to fix, and he'd have to worry about. So for him, turning her around and having sex with her from the rear was the way he liked to have sex. Now, he would say, our patients say, oh yeah, Bader, it's just my preference. You know, you can't really make too much of it. I say this, I say we make way too little of it. And maybe during the discussion, I'll also talk a little bit about sex differences, gender differences, and I'll just hint right now about what that discussion will look like, and then we'll stop, take a break. For boys, objectification helps them separate from their mothers. The separation individuation process is different for boys and girls. For boys, they have to develop a masculine identity as well as separate from the mother. So that's why masculinity often is brittle and a little rigid in boys and men, because it has to defend the boy against too much closeness with the mother. So when a boy objectifies a woman, a girl, it's part of his effort to maintain separation and therefore safety, you see. So there's an old joke in the US from a comedian, Billy Crystal. And he said, women need a reason to have sex. Men just need a place. And he's trying to point to this difference that with men, it's objectification. And for women, it has to do with the importance of connecting sex with love. That sex connected to intimacy and love is what enables a woman to feel safer. And some of the issues that women have involve giving themselves permission to have a certain kind of sexual freedom that they see men have and boys have. But it's inhibited because of their own guilt about having more of sexual authority and more of the good things in life than their mothers. So I just finish with this, read this one sentence to you, and then we'll take a break. This is what I conclude. I say, if sexual preferences and fantasies are unconscious attempts to negate or disconfirm our pathogenic beliefs, and if our psychopathology is our pathogenic beliefs, then sexual fantasies, not dreams, as Freud argued, are the royal road to the unconscious mind and to what at the deepest level really ails us.
Okay, how long would you like to break?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So we will see here in 10 minutes.
Good.
Okay.
All right, good, thank you.
Let's go with, okay, we can start.
Okay. So there's been some interest in talking a little bit more about how this works in therapy. And it's very interesting because this theory, I believe, doesn't just explain sexual boredom, but it also can explain good sexual chemistry. So what happens when the chemistry is good? And what we think happens has to do with aligning each person's pathogenic beliefs in the right way. So here's an example. So I treated a couple, we'll call them Jim and Mary. Now, Jim was one of these guys that we often write about, raised in a family where his mother was very unhappy with being a mother, very unhappy with her role. And he grew up very uncomfortable with his masculinity. And this is not that uncommon, that sometimes a boy grows up in a family where he infers that being a masculine boy will threaten his relationship with his mother or father. It becomes a problem, in other words. So this guy, Jim, he had this uncomfortable sense that being too masculine, too phallic, would displease his mother. And he always felt uncomfortable in those situations. So he was uncomfortable with competition with boys, and he was insecure around girls, and he felt anxious about, would a girl ever really desire him? He didn't really believe that deep down, you see, here's the pathogenic belief. He had this pathogenic belief that women didn't really love being women and didn't really love loving a man. That was his pathogenic belief based on his background. Now, Mary had a different background, way different. She was frequently rejected by her parents, who judged her in ways that communicated they were always disappointed in her. Now, she learned as a teenager that boys liked girls who were sexy, and she learned how to get attention in that way. But underneath it all, Mary was depressed. When Jim and Mary met, there was instant sexual chemistry. Here's how it worked.
Guarda sta merda, guarda, merda. Sei una merda.
Angela, l'audio.
Oddio, meno male che inglese sta guidando, ragazzi, scusate.
Okay, so there was instant sexual chemistry when they met. Here's how it worked. Mary was very skilled in flattering men sexually. When she used this skill in Jim's direction, he was just blown away. Why? Because it disconfirmed his pathogenic belief that his masculinity was problematic. Jim, on the other hand, was extremely attentive to Mary because this was his personality, and he was so grateful that she was motivated to please him sexually. And Mary was blown away that somebody took the time and the energy to really appreciate her and try to understand her. And it disconfirmed her pathogenic belief that no one would really value what she had to offer. So what I'm saying is this is very often the case that certain traits in each person naturally disconfirmed the partner's pathogenic beliefs enough to free up their sexual desire. And we call this sexual chemistry. It happens all the time in couples. Love at first sight is a real thing, not just the stuff of fairy tales, but it isn't magic. It's happening that our minds are processing our perceptions and experience of another person's personality, their appearance, their temperaments on a non-conscious level in the blink of an eye. It might be the sense that the other person has had a hard life, or that the other person instead is very strong and robust. It might be a sense the other person is comfortable being aggressive, or it might be the subliminal sense that the other person is comfortable adoring a sexual partner. So in each of these cases, the nonverbal unspoken cues are rapidly processed. I'll give you one last example of this. Here's another example. This is Tony and Anna. They were friends in their freshman year at college. Tony liked Anna, but he wasn't particularly attracted to her. When they came back from summer vacation in their sophomore year, he saw Anna in a class, and he felt an instant attraction to her, instant. He didn't know why, but he just felt this, what he called this buzz of attraction. It was only later in therapy with me that we figured out what happened. Here's what happened. On the day that Tony saw Anna, she was wearing a kerchief over her hair, tying her hair up. That's all the difference. What happened? Well, as we explored it, Tony associated to this different look and realized that it made Anna, in his mind now, look just a little bit masculine and therefore a little bit tough. And Tony was one of these guys that worried about women all the time. And therefore, when he perceived Anna as tough, it enabled him to feel this excitement. Now, his idea that she was tough was actually wrong. And we often see this clinically. Somebody will fall in love with their partner, be sexually in love with their partner because, let's say, they think of their partner as strong, okay? It turns out their marriage ends up being a terrible one because it's only the surface that the person is strong. Underneath, the person is very insecure, anxious, and needy. This is a very common dynamic. It's like, why did you get attracted to her to begin with? Well, I thought she was really strong. Well, she wasn't really strong. She was just a loudmouth. She just talked really loud and a lot. And you interpreted that as strong, but it wasn't strength, which you came to see in the context of the relationship, right? Or why did you fall in love with that asshole? Well, he was selfish, it's true, but I thought that was strength. It wasn't strength, it was narcissism. And now you're saddled with a guy who's narcissistic, who treats you badly. And initially, that was a source of excitement, and now it's a source of torture. So this is very common. I think I'll stop at that point, Francesco, and see if there's any questions or comments from anybody.
Ok, ragazzi, domande o commenti potete farle anche in italiano e glieli traduco io. Maybe you can start, Michael, with the question that I proposed to you about the fantasies of being excited.
Yeah, well, there's a common fantasy somebody has about their partner being with another partner. So a woman has a fantasy of her boyfriend with another woman. Boyfriend has a fantasy of his girlfriend with another man. These are fantasies that you can't, one thing we know in our theory is that there's no one size fits all interpretation. You know, there used to be books they would produce that would be interpret your dreams. Oh, if you're dreaming about, you know, an examination, it means this. But we realized, no, it just depends on the person. So I have had several patients who've had this fantasy. And one fantasy, the woman is a woman that I just recently treated, whose fantasy was her boyfriend with another woman. And for her, it was exciting because she could watch and she didn't have to please him. It was another woman doing the pleasing. Or a man has the fantasy of, let's get a three-way together. You know, my girlfriend and me and another man. Well, you know, if another man is having sex with your girlfriend, your wife, it's not up to you to please your wife. It's somebody else's responsibility. And I know that sounds very simple-minded, but I think it's often the dynamic. So you could take any one of these things and you can just step back and you could say, well, why would it be exciting to imagine having sex under the table while you're at a formal dinner party and there's somebody under the table who is, you know, having oral sex with you and you're pretending like everything is fine. For some people, that's exciting because it means that they're not guilty. There's nothing to be guilty about because the crime is happening under the table. So some people have the fantasy of having sex outside in nature, or somebody else might be a fantasy of having sex so that somebody next door can hear you. All of these things you have to ask, how is this a solution to a problem? Because that's how control mastery theory works at its best.
Ok, thanks a lot. Ragazzi, domande, osservazioni, anche in italiano gliele posso tradurre io, non vi preoccupate.
Io avrei qualche domanda. Se le faccio in italiano potrei farle in inglese, ma finiamo alle 11, quindi e non si capirebbero comunque. Quindi... prima di tutto volevo ringraziare perché è stato molto, molto interessante.
First of all, we would like to thank you because it was very interesting what you said so far.
Thank you.
Se posso, volevo chiedere due domande, una più teorica e una più pratica.
Yes, a couple of questions, one theoretical and the second one more clinical.
La prima forse ha già risposto, però volevo solo vedere se avevo capito bene. Se lavorare in psicoterapia non sulla sessualità e quindi sulle credenze patogene, secondo la control mastery theory, quindi non lavorando su focus sessualità, produce indirettamente anche come diceva lui prima, un ampliamento o una disconferma sulla sessualità.
Okay.
Quindi,
First
che tipo di ricadute ha?
Okay. You would like to know if working clinically about the pathogenic belief of a patient without focusing explicitly on sexuality may change the way the people experience their sexuality and broaden sexual experiences of the people. This is the first question.
Yeah, it's a very good question.
E la seconda più pratica invece era questa. Dato che le fantasie sessuali appunto sono così importanti per avere un quadro sulle credenze patogene, anche se la persona non chiede, la domanda della persona in psicoterapia non è specifica sulla sessualità o sulla coppia, comunque la indaga e come lo spiega.
And he would like to know, given that the sexuality is so important in our psychic life and sexual fantasies are so important for understanding pathogenic belief, if you don't explicitly ask about sexuality, how you investigate about sexuality?
Yes, very good. Okay, good. Very good question. Two very good questions. The first is, if you're working with someone around their pathogenic beliefs, but not talking about sex, might there be an effect? Might the consequence be a change in their sexual fantasy life? I would say possibly yes, in a limited way, because first, when I work with someone successfully to help them diminish the power of their pathogenic beliefs do not go away. They're not eliminated. They are lessened in intensity and power. So therefore, the sexual solutions remain the same. However, by reducing the force of a pathogenic belief, you can sometimes decrease the way in which the sexual fantasy feels obligatory or urgent or necessary. So, for instance, if someone's pathogenic belief is that they are too strong for others, and their sexual fantasy involves being dominated, for someone whose pathogenic belief is really, really intense, the sexual solution has to be very intense and very powerful. If the pathogenic belief is less powerful, sometimes the sexual solution can be more flexible and it could widen the person's repertoire. So I've had people that can only have sex if they're dominated. Then I help them with their pathogenic beliefs. Then they still prefer choreography of domination, but they can experiment with other possibilities because they don't feel that's life or death anymore. And what was this? Was there a second one, or did I address that?
If you, Stefano, vuoi sapere qualcosa di più rispetto a come ci lavora se non chiede direttamente?
No, è chiaro, chiarissimo, grazie mille. L'altra invece era sul fatto se appunto se ha un cliente o un paziente che viene lì con una storia che non chiede esplicitamente sessualità,
sì.
sulla sessualità. Okay.
And I would like also to know, Michael, if you have a patient that doesn't come to you having problems about sexuality, if you explore or how you explore.
Yes, well, I'll tell you, I don't. With, I would say, 2/3 of my patients, I never hear about sex, either because they're not having much sex or because their sex doesn't feel problematic to them, or because it would never occur to them to bring up the details of their sex life with their therapist. So I often have found it quite surprising. People think, what are you asking me about sex? It's none of your business. And I think I'm your therapist. You know, if it's anybody's business, it might be mine. But many people have just decided that they don't talk to me about money, and they don't talk to me about the details of their sex life. They don't tell me how much they earn every year, and they don't tell me the details of their sexual life.
And in these cases, you explore the domain of sexual life and fantasies or not?
Well, I do. Often people come to see me because they've read my books, you know, and so sex is on is in the table of contents for us. But if no one mentions sex, but they're talking about a relationship that is problematic, I will always ask them, how is your sex life? And half the time they'll say it's fine, and they'll change the subject. And usually I just let that happen. I don't ever push it too hard. But I always ask if they mention anything in the realm of a relationship.
As you know, Michael, I am one of the person who always ask during the first interview about sexual fantasies and sexuality, sexual experiences, and so on. I think
you're very unusual. It's very unusual. You're very unusual as a therapist. But it's very useful. If somebody just gives you a little bit of information, you have an enormous power in terms of your formulation.
Marzia, fai la tua domanda a voce, gliela traduco, così le persone iniziano a conoscere e associarti a volto e persona, perché sono anche persone degli altri anni, dai. Vai, l'hai acceso.
Eccomi. Ma in realtà non ho una...
Come l'hai fatta in chat?
Cosa?
La domanda l'hai fatta in chat, no?
No.
Come no? Someone asked if you noticed the differences among sexual fantasies in heterosexual and homosexual people. Come no?
The essential logic is the same.
Ah, non è lei?
No.
The logic is the same, but often the content might look a little different. Like the guy I presented who prefers to be penetrated rather than the one who's doing the penetrating. He likes to be fucked rather than be the fucker. For him, it's not about his sexual orientation, but it's about his pathogenic belief that he doesn't have anything of value to offer except his ass. And so the content might be different, but the logic is exactly the same.
Ok, thank you. Altre domande, ragazzi?
La faccio io una domanda.
Aspetta, chi sei che non capisco?
Sono Omar, eccomi.
Ah, oh, Mara, scusa.
Sì, vabbè, non c'è il nome sotto, giusto?
Sì.
Allora, mi chiedevo quanto è importante, no, per parlare di sessualità in terapia, un lavoro del terapeuta sulla propria disciplina interiore, cioè quanto è importante che lui sia in armonia con la propria sessualità e con i propri aspetti sessuali per poterne parlare in un certo modo tale da mettere ad agio il paziente poi su questi argomenti.
Okay. I would like to know how much is important, in your opinion, that in order to talk about sexuality in therapy, the therapist is at ease with his own sexuality, know his own sexuality enough?
That's a very good question. And I think that it's quite important that the therapist be comfortable with his or her own sexuality, because there has to be a willingness to experience sexual energy in the relationship. And sometimes the sexual energy in the transference is an important part of the therapist's window into the patient's psyche. So I think it's a therapist that's is uncomfortable with his own sexuality will never be able to explore freely the sexuality, the sexual fantasies of a patient. Never. He'll be too embarrassed or she'll be too inhibited, change the subject, not focus. And I think the embarrassment of the therapist about sexuality is often the biggest obstacle to a fruitful investigation of the patient's sexuality. It's a very good question.
And then it's something which is very interesting in your book, Michael, when you suggest that we can understand on the basis of a patient's sexual fantasies the kind of attitude that we as a therapist should adapt with that patient in order to make him or her feel safer. This is a very important point, in my opinion.
It's very important, and the patient has to feel safe. And the patient is reading the temperament of the therapist around this subject all the time. You can't stop it. So the patient's always, is the therapist uncomfortable? Is he embarrassed? Is he too interested? What does that mean? So the patient's always reading the therapist. Absolutely right.
Altre domande, ragazze, dubbi, interrogativi? Ragazzi, ragazze. Non abbiate timore.
Io se posso ancora farne una, la farei.
Vai.
Per chiarire. Volevo chiedere, l'ha spiegato prima, ma non so se l'ho capito io bene. Diceva che appunto le fantasie come disconferma, quindi permettono l'attivazione, ma non cambiano, non provocano un cambiamento che dura nel tempo. Mentre invece in terapia, quando noi disconfermiamo una credenza patogena di un paziente, seppur insomma più volte, si ottiene poi un cambiamento. E volevo chiedere come mai questo avviene.
Okay. I would like to know, Michael, why, in your opinion, while sexual fantasies enable a partial momentary disconfirmation of pathogenic belief, it's different when in therapy we work to disconfirm pathogenic belief so that the change is more stable. Which is the difference and why this happens, in your opinion?
It's a big difference and a very important difference. In therapy, the patient is learning, conscious and unconscious learning. And the learning is made explicit. In other words, it's an explicit learning between the therapist and patient. The patient learns, oh, I don't have to be guilty and uncomfortable about being too strong. I can be strong, and my therapist is happy with me rather than hurt. And I can experiment with it in my workplace. And my therapist and I can talk together about how my worst fear did not come true. Therefore, I will question the belief that generates that fear. In sexual fantasy, none of that's happening. It's happening unconsciously, it's happening non-consciously, and it's happening immediately on a level that never normally rises to the surface to be investigated. So that the patient isn't learning anything about his guilt just because he likes to watch rape fantasies in porn. All he knows is it excites him. That's all we ever know when it comes to that at that level.
So there is a sense of safe, but without insight.
Right. There's a sense of safety in the condition of the fantasy. So in other words, the sexual fantasy contains within it the conditions of safety. In the script, in the actual sexually exciting moment, there is built in a condition of safety about which the person is unconscious and unaware. In therapy, that's happening also, but the therapist, his effectiveness is maximized if he can bring it to the surface and articulate it with the client, with the patient. So I'm disconfirming my patient's pathogenic beliefs in practice all the time. But when I can actually notice it consciously and bring it to the patient's awareness, his learning and development is improved tenfold.
So you think that you are one of the people that thinks that the interpretive part of the therapeutic work and the ability to make explicit the pathogenic belief and so on, and to make the people aware of the links between these pathogenic beliefs, their traumas, and all the different ways this pathogenic belief affect their experience is important.
I think it's very important. I believe that the fact that people can get better without our interpreting the meaning of what's going on is a powerful bit of evidence for our theory. But practically, as a therapist, when I can understand what's going on in a corrective relational way, when I can become aware of it and then elevate it into a discourse of understanding, I think it's more powerful, because then the patient and I have a common language we can use to understand what goes on. So the next time he gets shy around a girl socially, and I might be able to say, you know, we were talking about how uncomfortable it was being masculine growing up in your family because of your mother and blah, 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 blah. So I guess that's happening again right here. And being able to do that, I think, gives us a powerful tool that we would be foolish not to use, even though we would argue that profound change occurs all the time because of corrective experiences that are never interpreted.
And I've never had experiences with patients that cannot stand your interpretation, always says that you are wrong, but they can change because of the attitude that you adopt and the kind of relation that you offer to them.
I think sometimes I have patients that get better because of the type of relationship we have that don't think much of my interpretations one way or the other. Like I just go, why, you know, I'm like talking and we're talking about this stuff, but basically the patient's not really hearing the words because they're experiencing the music of our relationship. And often I think it's more that my interpretations are incidental than that the patient is actively disagreeing. They don't know, why are you talking? You know, why are you trying to explain all of this?
Because I was thinking about one of my patients who anytime I try to say something, he says that I'm wrong, but he keeps on changing, symptoms disappeared, but I don't have to talk, basically.
Weiss loved that kind of case. I had a colleague, a very close friend and colleague, that presented to Weiss for 6 months, and she never made an interpretation once. And the patient clearly was getting better. And Weiss said, we have to understand what's going on here, because it can't be the traditional psychoanalytic approach that talks about the primacy of interpretation, because the therapist is not saying anything and the patient's getting better.
Ok, ragazzi, c'è qualcun altro che vuole chiedere qualcosa?
Io ho una domanda.
Emanuele.
Mi chiedevo, ad esempio, nell'esperienza magari di pazienti con sintomi, cioè con disturbi, diciamo, nella sfera sessuale, come può essere eiaculazione precoce, se un approccio di questo tipo poi ha effettivamente delle ricadute anche nel trattamento di questa sintomatologia.
Okay, Emanuele would like to know if on the basis of your experience, this kind of approach is effective also with people with sexual disorders, something like ejaculatio precox or difficulty in erection.
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's vital, actually, in treating someone with a sexual symptom like premature ejaculation or impotence. Because this whole theory is that sexual arousal depends on the conditions of psychological safety that one is able to establish or create with a partner. So when someone is unable, let's say a man unable to maintain an erection, we would normally investigate it, right? We would say, well, what is your fantasy life like? What turns you on the most? And what happens at those moments when you lose interest? Is it all of a sudden becoming aware? For instance, with one patient of mine, it's suddenly becoming aware of the partner's pleasure or lack of pleasure. So this guy would be fine, be having sex, and then unless his girlfriend was moaning and showing great sexual excitement, he would start to lose his erection because he would start to worry. He had a fear that he wasn't aware of, that she was bored with him. And he couldn't maintain an erection, excitement. He couldn't maintain excitement with the idea that the girl was bored. So yes, I think in each of these cases, there's something, and often I will say, okay, well, you have trouble maintaining your erection when you're with your partner. Do you have trouble maintaining your erection when you masturbate? And usually the person will say no. And then I'll say, well, tell me what your masturbation fantasies are. And then we're right in the middle of it. Because these sexual symptoms, they come and they go, and they have to do with the conditions of the person's psychological experience every time. And usually they involve a fantasy about the partner and about what he or she is feeling or thinking. And that interferes like static, like noise, with the person's arousal.
Ok, ragazzi. Qualcun altro vuole chiedere qualcosa? Alice? Non è il microfono, però. Non ti sento. Scrivi. We are waiting for her question because her microphone does not work. Is writing the question down.
It's absolutely fine. And whenever you need to stop, it's fine if there's no more questions. Yeah.
Alicia.
Nel frattempo io mi metto cioè vorrei fare anche io una domanda.
Dai, falla,
magari... Ok. E mi chiedevo se rispetto alla pedofilia c'è qualche tipo di, come dire, lettura possibile pure, no, all'interno della control mastering, e magari se si differenzia tra i pedofili più, diciamo, tra virgolette, predatori o quelli più accudenti in qualche modo.
Okay, you would like to know if you have some book or article to suggest about pedophilia, and if there is some differentiation in your theory between the more caring pedophiles and the more predator one.
There are different versions of a pedophilic experience. It's not always only one thing. And no, I don't know anything good written about it because too often the issue is clouded by morality and legality. So once you mention a pedophilic fantasy, everybody's association is the exploitation of minors. But what I'm saying is that if you actually hold that judgment aside for a moment and just look at the psychology of it, let's say a man has the fantasy that he is nurturing, caretaking, and developing a young boy or girl. And that is an essential ingredient in his sexual arousal. See, this theory is just intended to explain sexual excitement. It's not intended to explain everything that happens in a relationship. If the pedophile's relationship with his object is not sexual, and he never feels or she never feels any arousal, then my theory is irrelevant in understanding it. But if, let's say, caring for a young boy or girl is part of the excitement of it, then you would have to understand whether or not his feeling is he's giving to somebody who feels tremendously grateful for his love and his care. And that might be an antidote to a feeling that he has nothing to give to anybody. And instead, he gets to enjoy vicariously a situation where somebody who's young feels given to and taken care of. So there are multiple ways in that fantasy that it could be understood as a way of counteracting feelings of being disappointing or harmful or otherwise unlovable. For instance, there is a website called, if I can remember it, it's called sugardaddies.com. And at least here, sugar daddy is an older man that adopts a younger woman, gives her money and helps her with living expenses. And in exchange, she becomes his sexual servant. And so there's a lot of fantasies that are enacted there that are exciting. The man feels he just has to give her money, and he has somebody who thinks that he walks on water. And for many men, let's say, who hire prostitutes, that's the central exciting element of it, is that all he has to do is give her some money, and then he gets to feel as if he is the center of the woman's universe for an hour. And then she goes, and he doesn't have to feel responsible for her, and he doesn't have to do anything to earn it other than give her some money. And that can counteract a lifetime of feeling like no matter what I do, it's not enough.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah.
Alicia would like to know, think about a patient, a female patient who was severely traumatized, for example, from a sexual perspective, and is not able to have an orgasm and does not have any fantasy who make her get aroused. In a case such as this one, you would work in trying to figure out together with her fantasies which enables her to be excited, or you think that there is a more general problem of safety you will work on?
I would start, that's a very good question. It's a very hard question, and it's a very good one. I always would start with the more general issue of the person's trauma, that the trauma was usually a trauma in which they were rendered helpless and terrified, and there was nothing they could do to change the situation. So that person has to learn self-compassion and has to come to understand the way in which they took too much responsibility for what happened and they were actually innocent. So I would extend my empathy towards the person to help them heal the general conditions of post-traumatic stress that they present with. Now, when somebody begins to overcome some of those feelings, then they can sometimes turn their attention to sexual excitement. But as long as sex and sexual arousal is intrinsically connected to trauma, they're not going to ever talk about their sexual fantasies because even thinking about it is too dangerous. So the first thing has to be that the person comes to experience safety in their life. The second is to understand the conditions of safety in which they might be able to get aroused. And I'll say one other thing, that many people deny having sexual fantasies, okay? And I'm sure sometimes that's true. But if you took seriously my own account of it, that would be exceptional and not normal. Because, excuse me, even someone who claims to not have a sexual fantasy, usually what they mean is, I don't masturbate and have a scene in my head or a story in my head, like a private daydream. I don't have a sexual fantasy. Then you say, well, but you know, if you were honest and you were going to pick somebody apart, you might say, well, what kind of person are you attracted to? Well, I'm just attracted to someone who's nice to me, who's kind. Okay. So now we have the beginnings of them articulating a sexual fantasy. It has to do with the fact that kindness is arousing. So normally people will deny having a sexual fantasy, but their notion of what a sexual fantasy is much too narrow.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michael.
Oh, thank you guys so much.
As soon as we will be able to do it, we will invite you here.
I so love my Italian brothers and sisters. And thank you, Francesco, so much.
Thank you.
Thank all of you. Bye-bye.
Ciao.